His country was invaded.
You see the boat over there, Indonesian troops.
He was exiled for 24 years in a strange land.
I had never seen snow in my life.
He won the Nobel Peace Prize. In 1999, he finally came home.
I looked down to the city, to the seas, the sunset, and thinking of our newly won freedom, and I said, these have been an act of God.
9 years later, he only just survived an assassination attempt.
I felt a burning sensation, sharp. Then I was already on the ground when I was hit a second time.
He's a progressive voice in a firmly Catholic nation.
You cannot stop the youth from having sex.
My guest this week is Jose Ramos-Horta.
Thank you so much.
I've come to a tiny country in South Asia. East Timor was once a Portuguese colony, but after the Portuguese Empire collapsed in 1975, neighboring Indonesia invaded and annexed the island. Finally, after a bloody conflict that left more than 100,000 dead and many more displaced, it became the first new sovereign state of the 21st century. In 2007, after a spell as foreign minister, my host became East Timor's second president. But he's now in semi-retirement.
Yes, very happy.
Some tip him as a future Secretary General of the United Nations. How old were you when you first thought you were interested in politics?
Well, I was actually always very interested in journalism. I wanted to be a journalist when I was a teenager. And I began scribbling things and began writing for a local paper when I was like 17, 18. I got involved in politics by accident of history when the Portuguese colonial empire collapsed.
The young Ramos-Horta cut his political teeth in the anti-colonial struggles of the 1960s. In his case, against the Portuguese dictatorship of Antonio Salazar, who was desperately trying to hold on to Portugal's colonies, as he viewed his country as a source of civilization and stability for its African and Asian subjects.
The Portuguese first came to Asia, Southeast Asia, in the early 1500s, looking for the spices, the famous spices of the Orient. And once they came to Timor-Leste, they were interested in spices, in sandalwood. Then as the myth of the Portuguese Empire consolidated, it was no longer possible to say, we dump East Timor because too far, too poor, and let's keep Angola because it's rich. Because by then the myth was Portugal was on a grand civilizing mission. And if you are on a grand civilizing mission, that's why you are in East Timor. Well, I grew up in a Catholic mission school with a sense of fairness, of justice, not so much of freedom. So I was in a colony that was physically, geographically isolated, no television, no access to literature. So we heard everything via radio or word of mouth or books, magazines that were illegally infiltrated into East Timor. The feeling of sense of desiring freedom came in the 60s when I was in high school, when I started hearing about the Kennedys, hearing Kennedy's speeches, Martin Luther King's speeches, That was when I began to think freedom, think in justice.
And what happened here? I mean, there was a sense of an independent movement here.
No, definitely not back then. Only in the 60s there was already some thinking about it. We were remote from the liberation movements taking place in Indonesia against the Dutch, or in Africa, led by great luminaries from Nelson Mandela to Nkrumah in Ghana, Lumumba in Congo, or Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. So we were totally isolated. Only people of my generation, as we grew up in the 60s, we began to talk about freedom, about independence.
So by 1974 and so on, there was a clear feeling that the Portuguese were under pressure, as it were.
Oh yes, yeah. In 1974, it was obvious. There was a carnation revolution in Portugal that overthrew the dictatorship. The new military-led regime there pledged to quickly withdraw from all its colonies, particularly Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, and Timor-Leste benefited from that post-Portuguese carnation revolution. So we were being recognized the right to self-determination and independence.
Coming on to, there were great events in 1975, so let's take a look at those on our screens.
You see the boats over there? So inside our territory, there are at least 60 Indonesian troops and about 80 Timorese.
Some great pictures.
They are preparing a massive operation because it's very strange, 6, 7 boats together very close to our border.
Yes, 1975, I would say the year of living dangerously, the year of upheavals, of changes, of U.S. Humiliating retreat from Vietnam, the end of the Portuguese Empire, the Soviets, the Cubans expanding in Africa. In the context of the Cold War, post-Vietnam, anti-communist hysteria in Southeast Asia, the U.S., Gerald Ford, Kissinger visit Indonesia December 6, as the footage show vividly.
Mr. President, we have discussed a great variety of subjects. We talked in particular about the economic relationships between our two countries and our alliance and our security arrangements.
No thinking U.S. President or Secretary of State would, at the time, be able or be in a position with credibility telling the Indonesians, don't invade East Timor. U.S. had just flee Vietnam. And so it has no real credibility, even if it wanted, even if it had some moral qualms about Indonesian invasion.
But in fact, it didn't have moral qualms about
No,
that.
it didn't.
And they urged the Indonesians on.
Well, I wouldn't say that Gerald Ford or Kissinger told the Indonesians, go and invade. But they gave the green light. So we were at the mercy, we were sacrificed on the altar of pragmatism, of realpolitik. We were the sacrificial lamb in the post-Vietnam.
The very next day after President Ford and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, flew home from Indonesia to Washington, and just 9 days after East Timor had declared independence, Indonesian troops marched into the fledgling country, precipitating one of the bloodiest atrocities in history. Secret State Department telegrams, now available in the Gerald Ford Library, show that both Kissinger and Ford were aware of the Indonesian president's plans, and provided he waited until they had returned to America, they agreed not to stand in his way. When it actually happened that the Indonesians came in, when they invaded, you happened to be not here, but in New York.
Yes, I had been assigned by our main leader at the time, a great man, hero Nicola Lobato. He called me one morning and said, "You must leave the country, go to New York to represent our cause at the United Nations."
By 1983, when this particular film was shot, Jose Ramos-Horta had already been in the United States for 8 years. But in the early months of what turned out to be a lengthy exile, he was ill-prepared for the North American winter, let alone the rigors of being an activist turned diplomat.
I had very little cash, few $100 that was given to me from here, from East Timor, before I left. I had never been to New York. I had never been to a big city in my life. So the transition was quite dramatic from where I grew up, tropical backwater, to New York. I always fantasize, imagine about living in New York or being in New York, then arriving there in dramatic circumstances in the midst of the North American winter. And that particular year, December '75, was very, very snowy. I had never seen snow in my life.
Never seen snow in your life?
I had never seen snow in my life. And I stayed at Tudor Hotel, very run down at the time. The best room, I think, was like $20 a night. That's where I stayed. And walking to the United Nations, because the Tudor Hotel is next door, that's where they put me. I had to be very careful not to fall off because it was very slippery. And I didn't have a proper shoes. I had a very light summer jacket instead of a winter coat or winter jacket. So that's when I began my lobbying at the UN Security Council.
While Ramos-Horta was in New York fighting a diplomatic battle for his countrymen, in East Timor, activists took to the hills to fight a guerrilla campaign against the Indonesian invaders. Jose knew firsthand the cost of this war, losing 3 brothers and a sister to the Indonesian military. But it was also at this time that he was to start his own family.
I married in '78 in Mozambique to my ex-wife, who in East Timor now. She's the Prosecutor General, Ana Pessoa. She was still a student in Mozambique. She's East Timorese, studying in Portugal law. Then she went to Mozambique, and Mozambique was one of the countries that very much supporting us, like Angola, Portugal, Brazil. So that's how I met her, and we married soon after. We have a son who is now 33 years old.
How often do you see your son?
Well, back then, rarely, because when she was pregnant, I went to Mozambique, stayed to help her because she wanted to continue on studying. When the baby was born, I stayed on. I was the one who really, for many months, looking after her, after the baby, changing the diapers and so on. But I had then to go back to New York to resume my work in New York.
As the permanent representative at the United Nations of the Revolutionary Front for an Independent East Timor, Ramos-Horta had the thankless task of trying to persuade the world's major powers to take any sort of interest in the plight of his tiny island's people.
The US, Australia, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, all the major powers were concerned with stability in the region, stability in Indonesia. So who would care about a little country of 700,000 people? So we were left to ourselves. although at the United Nations in New York, Portugal, as the departing colonial power, put up quite a strong fight, diplomatic fight. And in spite of all of the difficulties, we managed to secure a unanimous resolution condemning the invasion and demanding from Indonesia to withdraw from East Timor. But that was also my first lesson in international hypocrisy. The Security Council voted unanimously condemning the invasion, calling on Indonesia to withdraw from East Timor. And I thought I would come back to East Timor 3 weeks later in triumph. I managed the unthinkable, a unanimous Security Council resolution. Well, what happened is that the United States and Britain in particular continue on to sell weapons to Indonesia, even though they voted to condemn the invasion and to demand Indonesia withdrawal.
What should have been a moment of triumph for Ramos-Horta had in fact been a meaningless victory. For the next 2 decades, he then traveled the world, tirelessly talking to whoever would listen.
As soon as I left the country, end of '75, I had been given a mission to the best of my ability to raise awareness about East Timor.
British weapons are used against the people of East Timor. The situation is deteriorating very quickly, very seriously.
But let me tell you, in that time, from '75 till the era of electronic media, with Timor-Leste cut off, it was literally like, you have to do like the door-to-door, talking to people. I would travel by bus, by car, crisscrossing the US, Europe, to talk wherever people wanted to hear.
The Secretary General of the United Nations.
Sometimes I would have an audience of 5 people. Sometimes I would have an audience of 12 old ladies sleeping in Chicago. I was in Chicago once, went to a conference. There were 12 ladies there, each of them at least 80 years old and half asleep. So, but I would talk to them anywhere, anyone who wanted, cared to listen.
In the 24 years of Indonesian occupation of East Timor, it is estimated that between 100,000 and 200,000 people died as a direct result of that occupation.
This cemetery contains some mass graves, the victims of an oppression which continues out of camera shot.
The population of Timor-Leste in 1975 was roughly 700,000. According to the best estimates, based on a Catholic Church investigation, Amnesty International, by 1979-81, out of 700,000 people, at least 100,000 to 200,000 had perished. Of course, not all perished from massacres, executions. Vast majority died of starvation, died of being uprooted by the war, fleeing from one area to another, but also died from summary and brutal execution, massacres of the entire villages that were suspected of supporting the fighters. The country was physically isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, so there was not a single humanitarian agency present on the ground. Even the International Committee of Red Cross had been forced to leave in '75. So between the end of '75 and '77, '79, there was not one drop of international humanitarian assistance. That it was caused the 200,000 dead.
The life of a campaigner for justice and human rights from a country that no one appears to care about can be a lonely one. While Presidents Ford, Carter, Reagan and Bush paid him little, if any, attention, José did build up a network of friends in important places.
So all those years I could see the US presidents only on television. I never met a single US president until Bill Clinton. I followed the US elections, I followed the conventions. Not even I was able to see a US ambassador because the State Department would forbid the US ambassadors in New York from receiving me. The most effective in support of us, our struggle, was the US Congress. For all its sins and faults, I have only appreciation to the US Congress back then in the 70s and 80s. Some of our best friends in the US Congress are still there. Then the US Bishops' Conference. If it were not for the US Bishops' Conference, it would also be very difficult for us to get prominent US congressmen engaged. So in the beginning, I was completely lonely, but then slowly, with support of friends, build up a network around the US. Then came more interest by the media when the Santa Cruz massacre happened.
The Santa Cruz massacre, when Indonesian troops killed 250 unarmed protesters in a cemetery in East Timor's capital, Dili, was the tipping point in the independence struggle. Television pictures of the massacre were beamed around the world, sparking international outrage. José Ramos-Horta found that diplomatic doors previously remained closed started to open. Then in 1996, a phone call brought unexpected news.
One day I was playing tennis on a Friday. I decided that day to polish my tennis. I play all day. And when I got home, a very humble, poor home, and in a place in Sydney called Warwick Farm. You know, no Nobel Peace Laureate or international luminary lived there, only me. And well, the phone call came from a Portuguese journalist in Lisbon. He managed to track me down and said, "Can you please comment? You have just won the Nobel Peace Prize."
And that was one of the nicest surprises you've ever had?
Yes, it was the nicest surprise, but I have to confess, I was embarrassed because I thought, you know, Xanana Guzmão, the resistance leader, who was in prison, who led the resistance before in the mountains, he was the one who should have gotten it. So I was a bit embarrassed. And a few days later, although he was in prison, we managed to speak on the phone because we smuggled a mobile phone into his cell in Indonesia. And he told me how, yes, if anyone deserved it, it was me.
And so at that particular point, you'd had these crises, you'd been outside of the country for so many years and so on. But now things are looking up with the Nobel Peace Prize and other things, but there were still shocks in store. And we'll find out about those in just a minute. José Ramos-Horta's lifelong campaign for justice has received worldwide recognition and has made him the tiny island nation of East Timor's most famous son. But back in the 1990s, he was a man without a country. A tireless campaigner against a brutal occupation.
The situation is deteriorating very quickly, very seriously.
But no one seemed to care, until a Nobel Prize put East Timor on the map.
José Ramos-Horta.
And world events created a major opportunity.
Things were looking much more promising at the time, particularly with Bill Clinton in office. He was personally far more sympathetic. He was familiar with the problem of East Timor, and he had spoken out to the then President of Indonesia about Timor-Leste way back, even in 96, 97. By 98, the Suharto regime in Indonesia was collapsing under the weight of economic financial crisis in Southeast Asia, corruption, mismanagement. Students went to the streets in Indonesia because of the economic financial crisis. The military withdrew their back into Suharto, and that was the window of opportunity for us.
Beleaguered by a financial crisis and amid charges of corruption, Suharto resigned in 1998. The new Indonesian president, B.J. Habibie, asked the United Nations to organize a referendum in East Timor to ask if the people wanted their independence. It would either lead to a clean break or a resounding mandate. In August 1999, over 70% of East Timor voted for independence.
Later, the militiamen were burning houses across Dili.
Pro-Indonesian militias still went on a violent rampage. Indonesian troops watched passively or even joined in. Bill Clinton implored Indonesia to admit United Nations peacekeepers.
What I would like them to do is simply to stop the most egregious forms of violence and to let the NGOs in to provide humanitarian relief right now.
On September the 20th, 1999, with Habibie's approval, the peacekeepers arrived. The Indonesian soldiers withdrew, but not before destroying 85% of the country's infrastructure.
The events of '99 were the most dramatic, promising in the beginning, but by August '99, September, violence erupted in East Timor. In the period leading up to the referendum organized by the United Nations, there was widespread violence, killings, burning. They needed the bridges as they left, so they didn't blow them up. But schools, public administration buildings, private houses, livestock, anything that they could burn down, they did.
"13 years later, those few weeks of destruction are still being felt.
Physical infrastructure that was destroyed has been mostly rebuilt by the government, by the international community, or by the common people, like housing. What today you see in Dili, the capital, is not what it was in '99. The soul, the spirit, the trauma is still very much there among many, many families. One can forgive out of you want to forgive, you are good, you are generous, you are compassionate, or you forgive because you want to move on pragmatically. But this doesn't mean that you can erase the wounds of the soul, that you can also forget your siblings, your family. So that is still there.
The Indonesians may have inflicted catastrophic long-term damage to buildings and property, but their withdrawal liberated the Timorese, affording them the first taste of independence in a generation. And the stage was now set for Jose, after 24 years, to return home.
I arrived back in the country December 1st, '99. After 24 years. To my surprise, and my arrival was unannounced, it was not announced for security reasons, but people knew, word spread. I was overwhelmed by the thousands of people who are at the airport to welcome me. It was very emotional, being welcomed home after 24 years, without fighting with guns, just being a spokesperson, using my pen or my voice without being a Che Guevara and guerrilla fighter, and made me feel small, humble, because those who welcomed me were the real heroes, because they were here. They didn't leave the country. They endured the torture, the fear, the death, and yet I saw a city thoroughly destroyed. It was overwhelming, the feeling of returning home in triumph against all odds, fighting empires, fighting mighty armies, starting off completely alone in '75. Then we prevailed. We didn't prevail militarily. We prevailed through patience, through diplomacy, through cunning politics, through peaceful resistance, but never once we manipulate religion or people's sentiments to turn people into anti-Indonesia or anti-Muslims. Zero manipulation on our side. When I arrived, I went up the hills just above Dili. I looked down to the city, to the seas, the sunset, and thinking of our newly won freedom, and I said, this has been an act of God. The dream has been realized, and this was an act of God.
In 2002, what some had dreamed of for decades was finally achieved. The first new nation of the millennium was declared, Timor-Leste, East Timor.
I have the honor to transfer executive authority from the United Nations Transitional Administration to the institutions of the Democratic Republic of East Timor.
The human cost was overwhelming. And sometimes I philosophically, I ask myself whether East Timor, whether any other nation, whether it is worth sacrificing a single life for the sake of having an independent country.
Viva Timor-Leste!
Or better find a political compromise arrangement that spare lives. So sometimes I think of that. But the fact is that people were prepared to die. And thousands of East Timorese were tortured. And it was extraordinary that even under torture, even in the face of seeing their own siblings being killed as a part of psychological warfare, they wouldn't give up.
A new nation may have been created, but now it was time for it to be secured. The first order of business, to elect a government. Janana Guzman became the first president, with Jose Ramos-Horta as foreign minister. But the new government faced a mountain of problems. Not just widespread poverty and unemployment, but also lingering factions unwilling to accept separation from the Indonesians. Almost from the day of independence, the country was plagued by street fighting. Riots erupted, houses were destroyed. The shining dream was giving way to a perilous state of lawlessness. With 100,000 displaced people and 40 dead, the Prime Minister resigned, and in July 2006, President Guzman asked Jose to replace him. His instructions: restore order.
I survived many incidents during the Wars of the Crisis in 2006. I was all over town during the day, during the night. Whenever gangs were fighting in the barrios, in the suburbs, I would go to mediate, to stop. I was in the middle of a violent gangs or fighting each other, and nothing happened to me. I felt totally safe. I could have been killed, wounded, accidentally, many times over in 2006.
For all his feelings of being personally safe, José decided to call in foreign peacekeepers. And then in 2007, he was elected president. But the violence continued, with pro-Indonesian guerrillas operating out of the mountains, just like José's compatriots had done back in 1975. And then in February 2008, the violence reached a shocking culmination.
East Timor is on edge after President Ramos-Horta was attacked in an apparent assassination attempt by the most wanted rebel leader 10 days ago. Alfredo Renado was shot dead by the president's guard. After addressing the UN Security Council, East Timor's ambassador told Al Jazeera it's vital for the UN to maintain a strong presence beyond its agreed one-year extension.
I left the house just before 6. That day I left earlier, towards the beach, towards the statue, Cristo Rey. Take me roughly 55 minutes of fast, brisk walk back and forth, 5 kilometers.
And then you're coming back again afterwards?
I heard the shots while I was 500 meters away. The shots came from my house, and I was worried what was happening in my house. I had relatives, I had people working here, and I was concerned about their safety. And so I came back. And that's when I saw at the gate, I saw an armed man in green fatigues with a modern automatic weapon. He lifted up, aimed at me, and as I saw the gun aiming at me, I turned around to run, to take cover under these trees here, but it was too late. He fired the first round. I felt a burning sensation, sharp, not very painful, it was just burning. Then I was already on the ground when I was hit a second time on the waistline to the right side. And then I felt bleeding, I felt my leg was not moving, paralyzed. I screamed, I called for help. I pulled out my phone. I phoned my chief of staff, my secretary. I said, I've been shot, call an ambulance. And the ambulance took about half hour to reach here. Doctors later told me that had I arrived 5 minutes, 10 minutes late, I would be dead, because by then I had lost more than 4 liters of blood. And the doctors were amazed that even though I had lost so much blood, I was still talking calmly, explaining to them what happened.
From the army hospital in East Timor's capital of Dili, José was then airlifted 700 kilometers to Australia. After 2 months of treatment, he returned to another hero's welcome. Within hours, he was calling on the rebels to surrender in order to avoid further bloodshed.
I was almost killed. I didn't want any more Timorese to lose their life.
And that's just what happened. After a national manhunt, the new rebel leader, Gastão Salsinha, facing overwhelming public condemnation, gave himself up peacefully.
The few remaining members of East Timor's rebellion have called it quits, handing in their guns and themselves to police.
Salsinia and 27 other rebels were tried and sentenced up to 16 years. But José proved to have a remarkably forgiving nature, and in early 2012, he offered them pardons. People say that you are incredibly merciful to people who have shot at you or done things against you, that you are very strong in forgiveness.
I believe in being compassionate. If I was given the gift of life, God saved me, the doctor saved me, and maybe by almost paying with my life, we bought the peace, because the moment I was shot, the country stood still, the violence stopped. People who were fighting each other before, they stopped fighting, the rebels surrendered. Until now, we have been at peace. And that was the price. If that was the price I had to pay, decided by God, then be it. At least now I'm alive and the country is at peace.
With East Timor finally at peace, it was time for the country's first peacetime election. And although José lost this time, it was still widely considered a victory for East Timor, a fair and democratic transition of power.
I never intended to run. I ran because I was really forced into, I accepted the petition people gave me, and I ran. But I said from day one, I'm not campaigning. I'm not campaigning against at least two of the candidates whom I admire a lot, both resistance fighters. Who am I? How low would I descend if I were to find ways to denigrate my rivals just to be re-elected? So the few occasions I spoke, I praised them, I reassured people they should feel safe with them, vote for any of them. So I was pleased that the people voted for General Taur Matanruak, fighter for 24 years in the mountains. I feel honored to be replaced by someone of that standing. So I won my freedom back, and the people won a new and great president.
And you said on one occasion, you said, there is life after being president.
Yes.
Is that what you feel?
Yes, that's what I feel. Actually, I'm surprised. I enjoy even more than I had anticipated being free. I still deal with the common people. I still try to help. I meet with the president, the prime minister regularly. Whenever they want to see me, I help in whatever way I can. I'm part of the country. I remain forever connected. So I can be useful without being president.
Despite the looming presence of Indonesia, the world's largest Islamic country, East Timor remains 97% Roman Catholic. So with everything he's been through, is José still a believer?
I believe in God. I have a great respect for our church, the Catholic Church. But at the same time, I have some disagreements with the Church or the Vatican over family planning, for instance. We have a very big population growth, 6-7 children per family. Although it's great to see the thousands of children every day going to school, back from school, smiling. We have a great children. They always smile, they're always greeting me, greeting everybody. But you have to think of the social, economic, financial cost. You have to think of the child malnutrition when you have too many families, too many children, and the families are poor. So it's not all romantic, having lots of children. And in that regard, I disagree with the church. The church doesn't agree with distributing condoms, for instance. You cannot stop the youth from having sex, and they have unprotected sex. So what does that mean? AIDS can spread. And I've been one of the few leaders in this country who again and again speak on the dangers of unprotected sex, on the dangers of this country going through an epidemic of AIDS if we do not take preventive measures now.
What would you say as you look back over your life so far? What's the most important lesson you've learned?
For me, the greatest qualities of leadership is compassion, being humble, being accessible. One has to be wise, obviously, to be a leader. You have to have a proper training, but leaders are born almost naturally. You grow as a leader over the years. You might have several masters, PhDs, but you don't have a quality as a leader. And but a leader must be also very humble, very compassionate, very forgiving. And when I look at the events in Middle East today and or in many other regions of the world over the past decades, why they happen? They happen because of corrupt leaders, unwise, not humble, arrogant, not accessible to the people. They build empires around themselves, close up, totally disconnected from the suffering of the people. And then they get surprised when mobs attack them and lynch them and overthrow them. So that's what I observe, I learn all these years. Power doesn't impress me. Powers of the kings, of the president don't impress me. What impressed me is the humility of those who are in power. Someone who is in power and yet he is accessible. He is humble. That's what impressed me the most.
Jose, thank you. It's been a privilege
Great pleasure.
to talk to you.
Thank you.
It really has.
Thank you. Thank you.